So this presentation is about object-oriented programming in Python, and this is our intermediate Python programming for Codivate, lesson 2. If you haven't watched the first one, it's on our YouTube channel, so you can go check it out. All right, so what is object-oriented programming? Also shorthand, OOP. So object-oriented programming is a form of programming where you use classes or basically these structures as instructions for building complex objects or complex things of data. Essentially, an object can be made from classes, and they can have two basic things: properties or attributes and functionalities. And as we dive in more depth into object-oriented programming in the future, we will cover both of these in depth. All right, so classes can include methods, which provide some kind of functionality to an object and to a class, and they can have variables or attributes, which basically are like their properties, or you can think of them as like being their description. All right, so why do we use object-oriented programming? Well, object-oriented programming allows code to be very concise. It allows you to reuse a lot of code. So let's say we were making some kind of code where we wanted to store information about a specific person. Let's say we wanted to keep track of three things: their name, their age, and their address. If we had, let's say, one person, making three variables, one for their name, age, and address, would be fairly simple. However, if we had, let's say, 100 people, making 300 individual variables would be tedious. You could potentially use an array, but you would still have three different arrays for three different variables, each of them having a size 100. But there should definitely be an easier way to represent this data, and there is. We can use objects. We can combine the name, age, and address variables into one sort of object, one object that has each of these properties. And this can allow code to be a lot more concise, a lot more reusable. Object-oriented programming also makes code easier to manage and maintain, which is very crucial for writing good code. So let's dive more into depth into this person example. So using the same three things, name, age, and address, we want to create three variables for that specific person and be able to access each. So we could do something like this in the left, where we have person 1 name equals, let's say, Jimmy. Let's say his age was 15 and his address was whatever, this example right here. And this would work. If we wanted his name, we could access that variable. If we wanted his address, we could access that variable. And then if we wanted to create a second person, we can call it person 2 name, person 2 age, and person 2 address, and so on. However, this is, again, a lot of variables to keep track of, and it's going to make your code a lot messier. Instead, what we can do is we can use an object and combine these three variables into this person 1 object rather than a separate one for name, age, and address. We can have this global person 1, which will have a name, age, and address associated with it. And this is where object-oriented programming can really come into play. So I've mentioned a few terms here, and there are also different terms, but that are really key to understanding object-oriented programming and just the terminology associated with it. So the first one is classes. So you can think of classes as being some kind of blueprint. It's a sort of guide to making objects. Well, then that brings about the question, what's an object? Well, an object can be thought of as some kind of variable which can hold other data. They can hold other data and other methods. And they're basically just data. That's what you can think of objects as being. We'll cover fields and methods again in the future, and then there's the term instantiation, which will be covered in the next 2-week video, as well as in our classes. And instantiation is the process of creating an object from a class. So like I said, classes are the blueprints. You can think of, like, if you're building a house, you have the blueprint laid out to exactly how you would build a house. But in order to, and the house itself would be the actual object. You could use You can make thousands of houses from the same blueprint. And essentially the process of creating a house from the blueprint or from creating an object from its class is called instantiation. Each object can have fields and properties. Like each house can have properties like the address associated with it, things like its color, things like its size, whatever. And it could also have like methods or functionality associated with it, like maybe things related to heating, air conditioning, plumbing, electricity, all these kind of things that are like functionalities associated with an object. These are methods. So fields and methods are very fundamental to objects and classes, and will be dived into a lot of depth in the future. So how do we create classes? Well, Python makes it really simple for you. All you have to do to create a class is write the keyword class. So as you can see in these two images, you can see the keyword class. Remember, Python is a case-sensitive language, so it has to be lowercase, all letters lowercase. An uppercase C would be different, would mean a different thing. So it has to be lowercase class. Then you give this class a name. So if we were creating a house, we would call it house. If we were making it to represent a person, we would call it person. And convention is to just capitalize the name of the class, although it's not necessary. This can be whatever you want. It could be absolutely any character or any alphanumeric character. So I could put absolute gibberish here, but it would still work. But typically it's convention to make it something that makes sense. And once you have this, what's known as a class definition, or just this first line, you can actually write code inside a class. And remember that everything in Python has to do with indentation. So indentation allows you to specify scope and allows you to specify kind of sub-parts. And there's no difference for a class. To define what's included inside a class, you indent it at one level more than the class level. So if the class was at the source level, or basically at the main level, then you would just indent it once. But if the class itself was indented, then basically whatever would go inside is just indented one more. So just how you would do something like a for loop or an if statement, etc. So the body of the class, the name of the class must be unique. So if I have this class dog, later on in my code, doing class dog would give you some unexpected results. But that's just the basics. We won't get into that too much here, but eventually you'll understand why. All right, then we have methods. So a class can have methods, and methods work basically exactly the same way as functions. You define them using the def keyword, give it a name, have the parameter list inside the parentheses, and you indent the contents inside. This should be very familiar, but now all we're doing is we're associating this function rather than associating it with the file itself or the module just having a global. Instead, we're associating it with this class. So rather than calling it with just print hello, you would call it by doing example, which is the class name, dot print hello. So essentially, methods are like functions that are associated with an object or a class. You can't call methods like you would a function, so you can't just, like I said, type print hello. You need to call it off the class, and to do that, we use the dot keyword. The dot operator allows you to call stuff off of an object. So example dot print hello allows you to call the function print hello from the example class. Next, we have parameters and return. This will just be a review of functions. It works exactly the same way. You can have parameters like num1 and num2 into an add function, and you can return their sum. And then calling example.add 10 and 20 will give you 30. And it will work out like expected. And once again, if the parameter list, if you only provide one parameter when it required two, you will get the same error you would have if you would have used a function. So the return and the parameter list works exactly the same way. Parameters allow you to basically pass in information from outside into the function, And the return statement allows you to pass in information from the function back outside. All right, so that was a review of, or that was an introduction to object-oriented programming. Methods and instance variables will be covered a lot more in depth in the future lectures, but this was a general overview on how they work and how classes are created. So these are our exercises. Our first exercise was to create a math class, a very simple math class that has 4 methods to it: add, subtract, multiply, and divide. We had already seen an example of how to do something like an add or addition, and you could just apply the same rules for subtract, multiply, and divide. The second method was to create a class that has a method which takes in a string and returns a random letter in that string. So you guys should have had experience using the random module from our introduction to Python course. So you can use that to get a random letter in the string. And then you could try to use, this is a challenge, but try to shuffle the string. Try to shuffle the string that was provided as a separate method. And an even bigger challenge would be to try to shuffle without using the random module. So I'm sure most of you must know the shuffle method in the random, or the shuffle function in the random module, but see if you could do it without. This is a fairly difficult one, but perfectly doable. And our last exercise would be to create a method that prints out a provided string, which will be the parameter, and it will print it out a specific number of times. So let's say we wanted to print it out 4 times. It will print it out like this: 1, 2, 3, 4, and form this kind of like pyramid. And this is our third exercise. So give those 3 exercises a go. If you have any questions, you can message your tutors on Discord for more information. And if you have any questions, you can also email us at internpy@codivate.org. However, we recommend joining the Discord because it's a lot faster to get in touch with tutors.